Hello and welcome to Access Chat. I'm delighted that we're joined today by Peter Torres-Fremlin, who is an author and is the brains behind Disability Debrief, which really covers disability-related topics. Perfect for us here on Access Chat because aligned with what we do. So, Peter, welcome. Please tell us a little bit more about the work that you're doing on Disability Debrief and the sort of investigative work and so on that you're covering right now, because the disability world is complex, lots of issues there, and quite often people feel a little reticent to maybe cover those. And yeah, if you could also give us a bit about your background and how you came to be reporting in this space as well, that'd be great. Thank you.
Hi Neil, really great to be here with you. Hi Deborah, hi Antonio. Yeah, I'm a disabled guy in the UK, which is how I was born. As Deborah knows, I then did a lot of my career abroad. I was based in Bangladesh and Switzerland briefly, and then Egypt, and I was working with United Nations agencies and international organizations on disability inclusion, furthering the rights of disabled people, particularly in employment. And a few years ago, I just sort of saw there's like exactly this issue. You kind of mentioned this level of complexity in the disability space, this level of how quickly things were changing. A lot of that's kind of good news in all the initiatives that were going on, this new popularity. A lot of it was bad news as well, in terms of how disabled people were being hit by the pandemic as it came. For instance, I started Disability Debrief as a resource for colleagues to help keep up with that news. I was curating the resources that were there, and then kind of one thing leads to another. You're curating, and then you're doing a bit of analysis, and then you're doing a bit of reporting, and then people started calling me a journalist, and I'm like, I'm a what now? And then it sort of became that. So there's a few elements to Disability Debrief today. There's still that curation of news. I think I've sort of gathered disability news from over 150 countries. So it's really a kind of unparalleled resource. I've also been able to commission reporting from around the world. So as I've curated news, I've seen the gaps. I've seen, say, particularly like we don't hear directly from disabled people in global south countries as much as we should. So I've gone out of my way to mentor and commission authors from those countries to bring them in. And I've also really tried to be a space for reflection for people working on disability inclusion, for how we're working. So that for a while was a kind of in a thinking together sense. And then recently I started some investigative pieces to bring more transparency and accountability to the way we work, and to make sure that we're kind of holding ourselves to the highest standards, to making sure that different people know what is going on in some of the most important initiatives there are. Happy to get into that, but that's a kind of overview. Neil, you said before the call there's just sort of too much information to keep on top of. I think there's definitely a problem we all have. We're overloaded with information, and Disability Debrief is kind of my contribution to helping readers navigate that and make sense of disability in a changing world.
So thank you. I've subscribed. So I think that sometimes the digests and the newsletters and so on actually can be useful. But I think that information overload is a real thing for everyone, and it's certainly not stopping. So I know Deborah's got a question, so I'll hand over to Deborah.
Well, and I would just say, right in line with what you're saying, Neil, the reality is, well, now we have AI, so do we even need reporters? Do we even need, I'm being sarcastic here, but I remember when AI first even though it's sort of just come out still, but still at the beginning, we saw brands, we saw marketing teams get let go. We saw content providers get let go. And, but I also think we realized pretty quickly as a society, that wasn't the way to do it. That wasn't the way to do it. But so I've known about your work, Peter. You and I have been friends many, many years. And I do know about your amazing work all over the world. And I've always been very grateful that you've been focused on the global South, because what I see, especially as somebody that's a Westerner myself, is that I just see people continuing to be left out in record numbers. I see things happening that there's a lot of reveals happening right now, not just in our space, but all over the world. And I think there is a real need to talk about this stuff, not name names. I don't want to talk about individuals at all. We don't want to embarrass human beings, but I think that your work is very important. And one reason why I wanted you to come on is because we have seen other investigative reporters, and there's some really powerful content that comes out from their work, and I'm grateful for it. But at the same time, somebody once used a term, flaming advocates, to me. And they said, if you just kill everybody along the way, right? So I think there's a way to do it that's more thoughtful. And also, these things are so complicated. To try to blame one person, that executive, that fund, it's ridiculous. These are so nuanced conversations. And I know that you wrote about one theme. You wrote out, for example, the IDA, but you've written about it 3 different times. It is such a complex topic. And that particular topic is not just about the IDA. That's about our entire infrastructure. And so one thing that I like about your work, and why I always take the time to read it and pass it on, is because, well, in the first place, you've been in the trenches for so long, you understand what's happening. A lot of us understand things, even though we might not have all the details. And so I was just wondering why you think your voice is having such success right now when all of these nuances that I just mentioned are happening.
Yeah, there's kind of, I guess, a few things to navigate here. I think there's definitely a place for flaming advocates. That's definitely part of the system. I'm flaming in a different way. I'm kind of more of a slow burn. I guess one of the ways I've been trying to position myself is as a critical friend writing from within a community. And so this is quite a hard line to balance, like how these people in working on Disability internationally are my colleagues, they're my friends, some of them are funding my work, others are supporting this work in different ways, and I want to sort of own that positionality, right? So this is also one of the ways that a report is different from AI. I'm writing from a place of sort of lived experience and being where I am in the different senses that is with the communities I'm connected to, the languages that I speak, but also this privilege of being in the global north and a male cis white disabled person. You're kind of particularly referring to this reporting I did on the International Disability Alliance, Deborah. For people that don't know it, it's the representative body of disabled people in the United Nations system and beyond. So it's a really important organization for the disability movement. It's what represents disabled people to governments in the international system, and it is the voice of disabled people. So it's meant to be run sort of for and by disabled people. There was in the administration of it, there was a bit of a sort of contretemps that led to an investigation commissioned by one of its donors. And basically my recent reporting took that investigation, made the results public, that they hadn't been made public before. It asked the people involved what they thought about it, whether they agreed with it, whether they didn't. It brought out sides of the investigation that hadn't been present. And I took a view on with the parts of the response that I welcomed and the parts that I didn't. I think this is kind of important for a few reasons. I think from the disability community, we ask a lot of other people to change. we need to set high standards for ourselves before we ask others to change. We need to behave seriously to be taken seriously. I am also a big believer in transparency and accountability and a more democratic approach. And I think transparency is a basis for more democratic exchange. It's for more equal participation and is essential when we think about inclusion, right? Because if you don't know what is going on and you're sort of disadvantaged in terms of power, it needs to be there. So that's the kind of the role that I found myself in, was that I was getting information. I wanted to address it in a way that did justice to the gravity of what happened, but respect to the colleagues and friends that directly and indirectly involved. So one difference that I took from I used some of the techniques of journalism, like the balanced and fair reporting, but I also took sort of techniques from being a colleague. Like I let people know, I'm starting this reporting, this is how I'm going to do it. So normally if you're doing an investigative report, you would do all your reporting and then go to your main target like a week before and say, by the way, mate, got some questions for you. But I didn't do that. I said to Ida from the beginning, I'm reporting this. I'd like to talk to you. I'm going to be asking X, Y, and Z as well. So that I really kind of see that it's shifting a bit. I'm more of a reporter now, but I mean, we're all colleagues in the sector, and somehow we need to use these relationships, to be transparent rather than relationships that sort of turn things into just like gossip networks, that kind of, because we're their friends, we can't say this. And I wanted to like give the tools that we can talk about these challenges. And the response from readers, which has been very positive, has been to say, well, these are challenges and the disability organizations I know at different levels, that there's leadership is kind of locked on. It's not renewing. We're having a balance. Like, how do you balance like professionalization and sort of a grassroots authenticity? Are they in contrast? Are they not? How do you balance the role of donors? So those issues are of really global importance to how we work, and then particularly like how we kind of operationalize this idea of nothing about us without us, right? What organizations and institutions does that come through?
I know that Antonio has a question, but as I have read all three of the reports, and I know a lot about the topic, but I like how you brought up things like, and I say this as somebody that probably falls into this category, in that they have a board that's not really qualified to do the job that we're asking them to do. Things like that. I mean, the nuances is not, and funders are sometimes, they have a lot of power over us. You holding the money, you have a lot of power, and that power is not always used for good. So it was just, I found it fascinating, the nuances you went to. But let me allow Antonio the microphone. Antonio?
Yeah. Thank you, Deborah. I was listening to Peter, also listening carefully to the introduction and to some of the work that he's doing, and particularly that you mentioned that you have done a lot of work in the global south. One of the topics that we have talked in Access Chat, in a kind of a hot topic, is about number of people with disabilities. Countries report the numbers differently. What our organization comes up with a number that becomes a reference to everyone to use, from analyst organizations to everyone is using that number that we know. I would like to know from your research, how do you see the current data and numbers that we have on disability, and that if you find them accurate, because I don't feel that they are accurate. But how can we evolve? And sometimes the numbers that we have give a false sense. Okay, here are they are this cap, and now we need to address. And I found that sometimes these numbers can be very problematic.
Yeah, that's sort of a question kind of at the heart of a lot. I think many of you might have heard the 15% or 16% figure of the world's population. I actually have an article that speaks directly to this that I spoke with a statistician, Jennifer Maddans, to really kind of get to the bottom of where this thing comes from, so I can link it for readers to know more. The kind of long and short story is the 15% estimate that we use is essentially a bit of a guesstimate from the World Health Organization. It's a kind of like statistical guesstimate, but basically like they did a bunch of modeling and like looked squinted at some surveys and then came out with a number that sort of really sounded great and that we could all get behind. Out alongside this, in parallel, there is an increasingly accepted international methodology called the Washington Group Questions on Disability. That's being used. I think it's maybe close to 100 countries are using that. It's got a specific set of questions. It doesn't, for instance, like just for viewers to know, like it doesn't ask people like, do you have a disability? As if you just ask that, it's not going to be a very accurate answer given the diversity of disability experiences, and people don't label that. However, as also US audience might know, that the application of that in the US was talked about earlier this year and then rejected by the US disability advocates that did not approve of using the international framework and methodology in the US. And I think then the US Census Bureau is adjusting that. So it is like you're saying, Antonio, it's a hot topic. In the case of the US, the numbers were higher, and there were the concerns that like the adoption of this new set of questions would be lower. And there was also this concern, well, a lot of us are kind of politically identifying as disabled, and that's not being measured by these questions that don't use the word. Antonio, I know that you want a number. I'm not going to give you a number that isn't. I'm not sure kind of what would make sense as a number. Like it's given like what you need the number for, then determines what kind of number you want. So, for instance, if you're doing general advocacy, the 15% is quite a good number because it comes from a very reputable source. It's been standard for a few years, and it gives you a rule of thumb that like one in 6 or 7 people have some form of a disability, and that's the sort of rough ballpark. If you wanted a different set of programs or wanted to really drill down or refer to a sort of national survey, then you would really need to go in more detail. I personally am not so hung up on numbers. I'm sort of interested in people and the different experiences and the challenges that they go through, and I'm kind of focused. Those are different forms of data, right? The kind of more qualitative data, or sort of quantitative data that's tied much closer to specific issues, and I kind of navigate like that. But I'm not doing an advocacy where I need to get a policymaker's attention that they should care about this issue. When I did that, I'd use the 15% number for sure and say, look, it's WHO. It's what more reputable thing could you want, right? But obviously afterwards, I'm going to be like, well, I mean, it could be more reputable, couldn't it?
Maybe. So I think whichever set of numbers we use, they're big. I think maybe the concern is sometimes there's a worry that we're overstating, and I think that the worry comes not so much with the size of the population that are impacted by disability or long-term health conditions, but sometimes when we're talking about market statistics and the finances around disability, there is a lack of rigor, when it comes to how these numbers are arrived at, and really, a lack of sort of depth into the research when it comes to arriving at these numbers. So there's a feeling that there's sort of inflation because people want to get the point across, and I think that can have a somewhat damaging effect. I think that the numbers are large, whether you say it's 15% or it's the 26% of UK women that come up in the Office of National Statistics latest stats, or the 2 billion people that are supposed to have a visual impairment. So, it almost doesn't matter. The numbers are so large, it's a really significant part of society. Let's just please effing get on and try and make a difference, because I think we can be a bit too hung up on it. But it happens. Whenever I meet a new senior leader, we've been through a few CEOs in my organization over the last few years, and whenever I get to meet them for the first time, they ask, well, how many of our people? And of course you go, I don't know, because they probably won't tell you. Because there are all of these sort of systemic issues, and you can see them sort of almost glazing over. They want the easy number. When you get a good one, they listen to you and go, oh yeah, this is quite complex. Okay, I understand. I'm willing to learn more. So numbers do definitely play a role, but maybe more than they should. So.
But Neil, I can give you a kind of a practical example on that. Is that on the last census in Portugal, they changed the questions on the topic of disability, and suddenly a huge number of people, comparatively with the previous census, no longer exist. So suddenly, people with disabilities have disappeared, and this has impact on public policy. Politicians make regulation, make supports. And that impacts a simple question, end up having impact on public policy on people.
Yeah, I agree. So I think but this is where the Washington Group questions and the standardization around Washington Group questions is a sensible thing, because then hopefully you don't get these incredible fluctuations in the representation of the population, which then influence funding decisions and policy decisions. Deborah, I know you had a question.
Well, I think this is very interesting, this conversation. But Peter, as we're having these conversations, things are very complicated, especially if you start talking about it from a global scale. So what's next for Disability Debrief?
Yeah, no, thank you. That's it's a kind of evolving project made with the community that reads it. I've been really happy this year to get a broader range of writers alongside me. I've had pieces from Yemen, from Indonesia, from Belgium. I'm really proud to have these sort of brilliant writers alongside me. I want to keep on holding that space where we find new ways to tell stories about disabled people. One of the key motivations for me under this is that working on disability policy, I did not find the way we're talking about disability matched my own lived experience. And I think that's a really creative gap. And I really want to sort of lean into that gap, to be honest and learn from the policy and activism that's there, but also to find creative new ways to write about it. So in my own life, I've been sort of using spoken word poetry as a tool to do that. I put some of that on the debrief earlier in a poem called Fall With Me, which didn't even mention the word disability, but it was a kind of autobiography of falling over as a child, and that I know that can reach people and communicate issues in a way that sort of sticking to our greatest hits is very useful in the contexts that we're using them, but doesn't kind of get to that human side that we're all sort of trying to figure this out and the complexity of life. So I'm pushing contributors to do the same. I really want to grow in that direction. I'm also sort of, now that I'm sort of accidentally doing disability media, that's kind of what it came from, and making this media for our community, I really see the need for more investment in our communications and media. So obviously, like, a part of me is then arguing people make that investment in me, but it should not just be me. Like, we need to resource people that share news, help us make sense of the news, report on the news. Again, this is like fundamental to democratic operating. This is what we would see at the level, a society level, that look, we need a media. The disability community also needs media makers for ourselves and to get our message outside. So I'm looking how to collaborate with other people making disability media. We're all a bit sort of separated and isolated and figuring out how we're doing it. So I want to connect and really look to how we strengthen that case, how we send that message to funders that you shouldn't just be looking at programs. You should be looking at the infrastructure that will continue to get the information and knowledge to the people that can use it, right? So that's a kind of area for future growth. And Deborah, you know how it is, the world keeps coming up with interesting plot twists, and the interesting plot twists going on affect disabled people quite intensely. Disability is also like an avenue through which to say, like, explore how is ageism and ableism impacting the US presidential election, for example. How are disabled people's experience illustrating what is happening in the climate crisis, for example, right? This is kind of what I call a sort of disability lens, and I think that's a kind of constant thing to stay on top of and be responding to. Sadly, I never sort of intended this, but then a lot of my work has been about disability and conflict in different areas, from Ukraine, Israel and Palestine, sort of Sudan, and it's very painful. It's very painful reporting. It's very painful subjects. But this, I think, it's kind of important, both because it sort of speaks to really sort of critical populations and critical issues, but for also people to understand, look, there are people like, for want of a better phrase, underneath the bombs that we hear about, and we need to understand the situation it throws in new light. So I mean, there's covering the news, there's a lot of tough stuff, as well as learning from the brilliant sort of activists that are making a new world and listening to people find their power and telling their story in their own voice.
But when I follow multiple sources online, like many of you, and there are a few entities like Bloomberg, Reuters, Associated Press, who somehow dominate the distribution of news around the world. How could them do a better job reporting on disability? How would you see connecting your work with theirs? How can we improve that type of reporting? Because sometimes, even when you go to the filters that they use on their apps and systems, it's very confusing the way how they frame disability, how they use the keywords. So sometimes when you believe you are using the right keyword, you end up with news that have nothing to do with disability but show up on those filters. So how do we improve?
Yeah. No, Antonio, you're totally right. Mainstream media is still quite hit and miss on disability, and the misses are quite serious because they get to quite a few people. There is, I would say, there's good trends in that they're increasingly reporters with disabilities reporting on disability issues. So I think there's a lot more good stuff out there. But I mean, even when newspapers have that asset, they still might put out a really flagship editorial or sort of like, for instance, The Economist did a cover showing a walker, like as a Zimmer frame, and say underneath it they said no way to run a country, and that was the way they were referring to concerns over President Biden. It's just like absolutely ableist and ageist metaphor, and it's a grotesque use of assistive technology. So I think that sort of speaks to where, and like to get a cover on The Economist, that's been approved by a lot of people, right? And a lot of very powerful people. So I think that sort of is an example of where like there's still a massive way to go. I'm going to give a sort of a slightly perhaps dissatisfying answer on this. I am not fighting that battle now. I am not going to justify to editors that our story is worth telling, that disabled people are worth writing about that. I am writing for a community that believes that, and a community curious in finding out what it looks like. So I take my position, which is I am making media for the disability community and the disability curious, seriously. I think we need a protected space that's our space, that we can find the best stories for us, not thinking about how I justify this to an editor or how I make this worthwhile for the general population, right? So I've got quite a radical stance on that. Obviously, it is very important that then people, like your question, absolutely important, like, and as people are like tackling mainstream media and making those arguments with editors that don't want to know, and shifting it. And in some countries, you can kind of see really sort of exciting shifts in public discourse. But I think we kind of need to like have that separation as well, and have a media for us, by us. And that's at the moment, that's what I'm focusing on.
Okay. So I think that there most definitely is a need for well-informed, connected writing and media written by the community for the community. My concern about only doing that is that we live in our own bubble and no one else gives a toss about us. I almost said poop then. And so I think there's a need for both, right? I think
Absolutely.
The mainstreaming of disability in the media is really important, and disability in mainstream media, as well as quality reporting. I think that, like you, I think there's been some progress. Certainly in some countries, I think that it's varied. If you look in the UK, there's an awful lot of representation now in like disabled presenters in mainstream roles that are just doing mainstream presenting jobs and existing, which is great because they're a mainstream presenter. It's showing society that disability is just part of the makeup of life on the planet, right? And that is great, but at the same time, it's not the same as they're not talking and contributing about the particular issue. So we need to do both of those things.
No, absolutely. And sort of, I guess one of the ways I see sort of my place in the theory of change is that I love that my work is read by people making change in their professional and personal lives, whether there's people working on sort of frontline organizations that are supporting disabled people in disasters, whether that's read by academics. Among my audience are journalists that are doing precisely this work that you mentioned, Neil, and sort of I hope I can give them a resource. That for me, I quite like being in this position. I can help get information to people making change. People also like yourselves that are going to have the arguments with business leaders and need to have information, or people that get asked by their colleagues, what about disability in this subject? And they have to kind of rapidly find out about that. I've got a reference for where they can find out about that. I've got tools that they can use to have those arguments. So that's kind of where I see my place in the theory of change at the moment. And I really, so many people are waging really important fights, and I want to make sure that they have a kind of easy source of good and trusted information that they can use in those fights, and whether that's, like I say, professionally or in their personal lives, right? Yeah. Because many of us are sort of figuring this out, like how do I say this to a family member? I got a really moving comment from a reader that my poem about falling was something she thought about when she fell over the other day. And I was like, we need words to hold on to, right? Like we need in the critical moments in the personal lives as much as the professional lives.
We also need our journalists and our investigative journalists and reporters to be part of our community.
Yeah.
To have lived experiences as part of our community. Our voices do matter. And there's a lot of really good resources out there. There's a lot of good content that's being put out there. But I just think the Disability Debrief is also a really powerful, it's just got such good reporting, such good research, good data. And it feels to me like it's being presented in a balanced way. I appreciated that, because it's easy to point fingers and say, oh, you are bad. Well, you know what the reality is, if you were in that same position, how would you have handled it with all of the... I think it's so important right now that we don't attack humans, because people have tried really, really hard to do the right thing in these ridiculous situations. So it's just really, I appreciate Disability Debrief. Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent. So thank you for a great conversation. I look forward to continuing it on social media shortly. Once again, thank you, Peter. Thank you also to Amazon and MyClearText for keeping us on air and keeping us accessible and captioned. Have a great time, everybody. Enjoy listening to this. Go read the Disability Debrief.